Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Layo. I am the founder of Layo's Academy. On this channel, I break down IT audit in simple and practical ways so that you can understand it and be able to apply it and also grow with confidence as you go along on your IT audit journey. Today, I'm going to be talking about identifying control failures in IT audits. In my experience performing IT general control testing, one of the key areas of focus is being able to identify control failures across the different ITGC domains. And most times, this is not just about understanding controls in theory, it is actually about you being able to recognize when a control is not operating as it is intended to operate in real scenarios. So, what is the relevance of control failure in IT audit? From an audit perspective, being able to identify control failure is very, very critical because this is what directly impacts your ability as an IT auditor to conclude on your control effectiveness, on your test of effectiveness. During my course of previous IT general controls testing, one other important thing is that control for failure supports external audit requirements where clear documentation of expectations and their impact is also required. So it is relevant evaluating control effectiveness, it is relevant to support audit conclusions, and also to be able to enhance your interview and walkthrough discussions while you are testing. So control failure is very important and one of the things you have to pay close attention to. Before I go further, let me define control. Some people will be like, oh, why is she talking about a control failure? What is even the meaning of a control? In practice, controls are designed to mitigate specific risks within a process or a system. You have identified there is a risk, so you are putting something in place to mitigate or control that risk. When performing walkthroughs, I would typically focus on understanding the control objective, the risk it is addressing, and how the control is expected to operate. So that is what a control is. It is actually designed to mitigate risk within a process or system, to detect if there's any breakdown, and also to ensure accuracy, completeness, and reliability. Now, what is a control failure? During testing, a control failure is identified when the control does not operate as defined. There would have been a control objective, a control definition, and if the control is not operating at that efficiency, then it becomes a failure. It could be due to the control not being performed or executed at all. It could be due to the fact, yes, they're executing the control, but it is being performed incorrectly, or it is not even performed within the required time frame. Let's look at an access management control scenario. What is the control around access management? As we all know, access management controls are controls put in place to ensure there's no unauthorized access. Control for this case that I'm looking at is approvals required before access is provisioned, and a failure would happen if access is granted before approval. Look at it in this case. It is not that access was not granted. Access was granted, but it was granted before approval was gotten. Okay, in a real life scenarios of an access management review, testing of user provisioning control, to be specific, you are selecting a sample of users from the population and you are reviewing the associated access request and approval evidence. However, there's a particular instance or user, yes, there was approval, but the approval was given after the person already had access. That is a clear definition of control failure because the control is supposed to ensure that approval is gotten before access is granted. So in this case where yes, approval was gotten but it was after access was granted, that is a control failure. Now let's look at, from an audit standpoint, what is a control deviation, like control deviation analysis. This is represented if there's a deviation from the control design. The control is requiring approval prior to provisioning and the sequence was not followed. That is a deviation from the example I gave earlier. And this increases the risk of unauthorized access and it will be documented as an exception or a control failure in your, it should be, documented as a control failure in your work paper. Let's look at a user termination control scenario. The control is access should be removed within SLA. Failure. The access was not removed. The access remained active. That is a control failure. So if I'm testing the timely removal of access for terminated users, the expectation is that access should be removed within a defined SLA, which is typically within 24 hours. However, if you identify a case where the access was not removed and the access was removed beyond that 24 hours after termination, that is a clear case and example of control failure. Now let's look at the risk implication. What is the risk implication in the case of access control testing, which is one of the domains of ITGC? What is the risk? This type of issue presents a very, very significant risk, particularly if the system is supporting financial reporting or sensitive data. Unauthorized access after termination would increase the likelihood of inappropriate transaction or data exposure. So unauthorized access risk, potential data exposure, or a weak control environment. It's typically saying that this control is weak, it's failing. Now let's look at a change management control scenario. The control is approval before deployment. Failure is changes deployed without approval. When testing change management controls, you need to review change tickets to confirm that approvals were obtained prior to migration. However, in a case where you observe that the changes were deployed to production without the documented approval, that is a control failure. And then lastly, let's look at the third domain of ITGC, IT operation control scenario. What is the control? Backups being monitored regularly. And then the failure, backup failed with no follow-up. Okay, so in IT operation testing, if you are reviewing backup logs and monitoring evidence and you find instances where backup failures occurred but there was no documented follow-up or resolution or ticket to monitor it, that is a clear case of control failure. I've gone through the 3 different ITGC domains. I've talked about a few control types and what failure would mean. So I want to believe this will give you a clear understanding or definition of how to identify a control failure. In all of these scenarios I've given, the approach should be you assessing both design and operating effectiveness. Evaluate first whether the control is designed appropriately, and then we are going to evaluate whether it operated consistently over the testing period you are testing. So from an audit approach, you need to assess design effectiveness, assess operating effectiveness, and evaluate the risk mitigation. When you are reviewing evidence, 3 important things you need to focus on. 3 key attributes. 1, completeness, to ensure that you are looking at the full population in scope. Accuracy, to ensure the evidence is reliable. And then timeliness, to ensure that the control was performed within the required time frame. So you would often come across questions like this in your interviews. How do you identify a control failure? How do you know that, have you give me a scenario or an instance where you identified a control failure and what you did. When you are discussing these scenarios in interview, always ensure to structure your response clearly. Make sure you are explaining what the control was actually expected to do. Make sure you are explaining what you observed while you were testing. And then make sure you are explaining why the deviation represents a risk. The last one is very important. You need to explain clearly, like, here's this control failure and this is the risk associated with the control failure or control deviation. Make sure you explain the risk impact. From experience, control failures are not just errors. They are actually indicators that the control is weak, or there's weakness in the control environment, and that it needs to be addressed if it is going to reduce the risk or mitigate the risk that it is intended to mitigate. This is just a short description of how you can identify control failures. In my IT Audit Fundamentals book, I have detailed chapter, a whole chapter dedicated to identifying control failures and your ITGC, how to test your ITGC in full. As you continue learning, I encourage you to move beyond the definitions and focus on practical application. I encourage you to understand how to identify and evaluate control failures. This will significantly strengthen your confidence in both interviews and real work. Like I said, you need to continue learning control evaluation, have a thorough understanding of controls, practice how to assess the risk, be able to apply the concepts you are learning in real scenarios. I have different resources available in my digital store, link in my bio. I have hands-on and testing labs for real life hands-on practice that would help you in your IT audit journey. Thank you. My name is Layo. I hope to see you in my next video. Have a blessed day. Thank you.